Hello, everybody, and welcome to our afternoon Zoom. And this is a master class here at Montgomery County Community College. I want to thank everybody for attending, both virtually and some of us in person. Also, I'd like to thank Arthur here for putting together this great presentation and for coming over and helping to understand some more about your backyard, the Philadelphia music scene. And it can't go without saying that I saw Joe Tarsia on here, and this all would not be possible if it wasn't for the noble Joe Tarsia, that's for sure. He started this whole thing as far as Sigma Sound goes. So without any further ado, I'm David Ivory, the director of the Sound Recording and Music Program here at Montgomery County Community College, and I'm going to turn it over to Arthur Stoppe, staff engineer at Sigma Sound, and he will continue the rest. Thanks, Arthur, for being here. Appreciate it.
Well, I want to say hello to everyone who's here and out there on Zoom. I see that a lot of Sigma Sound people have signed on. That's great. Hopefully there's more to come, and I'm also hoping that some people from the AES, both locally and elsewhere, have also been able to sign on. Before we start the video, which is called Sigma Sound, A History in Pictures, I just wanted to say a few things about it. It's a history and a virtual tour of Sigma Sound Studios. It's not a history of the sound of Philadelphia, musical history. That's really well beyond the scope of what I was able to do and the original purpose of this video. So it's more a history of the studio's facilities and the technology those facilities embodied over the years. It was all tailored towards an audience for the Audio Engineering Society, audio engineers and other members, as it was first shown at last fall's AES, which was in October 2020, and it was held online and instead of in person. It's usually, a big event at the Javits Center in New York City, but due to the pandemic, it was done online. The story in the video is told through some of the many photos I took during my nearly 25 years at the studio. Before I wanted to become an audio engineer, I wanted to be a photographer, and I even worked at that for about a year before I went into the studio. And even though I had gone into audio, I kept taking pictures. Again, as I said, but the video was originally done, for the 2020 AES as part of the historical track, the historical committee's presentations. And it goes back even further, though, to what I call my Sigma slideshow, which was literally just that. It was like 4 carousel trays of slides that I put together that mainly got shown just to other people on the Sigma staff. I showed it a very abbreviated version of that at a 2017 AES event. And it was also shown early last year at what we were calling the Save Sigma Sound event, which was a gathering of people who were interested in getting the Sigma Sound building declared a historic site. And I wanted to just thank a few people. First of all, the people who've provided me with some additional photos to supplement mine and fill in the gaps for events that I didn't have pictures of, starting with Dave Moisiadis, a former Sigma Sound engineer in the early days, and he provided photos from that time period before I got to the studio. And also I want to thank Mark Steele and Avi Steinhardt for news photos of events that I didn't have pictures for. And finally, I want to thank the people on the AES Historical Committee who helped make the video possible. That includes Gary Gottlieb and Dan Mortensen. Dan was particularly helpful in getting the video put together and shown. And one last thing before we run the video, I just want to point out a couple discrepancies and errors that I haven't had the time to fix yet. The video says that getting Sigma Sound's building declared a historic site was still pending. That has actually happened in the spring. And let's see, some of the musicians and other people in some of the early Sigma photos may be misidentified. The people from Sigma New York tell me that their Studio 8 was on the 9th floor of the Ed Sullivan building, not the 8th floor, the way I say in the video. And there's a couple minor technical errors in terms of identifying some of the equipment. I'm not going to say what they are. If you spot them, great. I'm not giving out any prizes for that. And with that, I think it's time to roll the video.
And we'll take questions at the end.
We will be taking questions at the end.
And they can put them in the chat, and I'll read them out loud.
Okay, yeah. I don't know if you heard that. The people out there on Zoom can put questions in the chat, and we'll read them and answer them at the end.
All right.
Hello, my name is Arthur Stoppe, and I should start out by telling you something about myself. I worked in and around Sigma Sound Studios in Philadelphia for almost 25 years, from April of 1973 to February 1998. With the exception of Sigma's founder and owner Joe Tarsia, I was probably Sigma's longest-running employee. This is a rare photo of me behind the console from the early 1980s. It's rare because I usually was the person behind the camera taking the pictures. I had worked as a photographer before getting involved with audio recording, and I continued my involvement with photography even after I had switched careers. During my time at Sigma, I worked with just about every one of the Philly Sound artists, including the OJs, Patti LaBelle, and Teddy Pendergrass. Some of the other artists I worked with included Stevie Wonder, Robert Palmer, Grace Jones, and Edgar Winter. I worked on recording sessions ranging from voiceovers to big orchestral dates and just about everything in between. What I'm about to do is to give a virtual tour and pictures of Sigma Sound and its history. Most of the photos are ones that I took during the late 70s and early 80s during the heyday of the studio and the Sound of Philadelphia phenomenon. The photos range from formal shots I took to document the facilities, some of which were published in magazines and books, to candid photos of some of the artists, musicians, and producers I worked with. And of course, I took a lot of photos of the studio staff. I wasn't there for Sigma's start, and I wasn't there at the end, but I did document some of the time when the studio was at its busiest and best known. In the instance of places and events I didn't have photos for, I've filled in the gaps with pictures from various other sources, which I'll acknowledge whenever possible. I hope the photos and my brief history of the studio will give those of you who never got to visit or record at Sigma a feel for the place and the time. I'll also cover some of what went on at the facility Sigma opened in New York City. The Philly Sound was, and still is, an international musical and cultural phenomenon. Sigma Sound was at the center of it all, and I consider myself very fortunate to have been a part of that. I think that most of us at the studio didn't realize just how big what we were involved in was at the time. We were all too busy making hit records. Sigma was a big part of my life, and still is, which is why I'm speaking to you now. I hope my photos and what I have to say about them can convey some of what Sigma Sound was all about. The story starts with a bit of prehistory beginning in 1930 when the two-story building at 210 and 212 North 12th Street, Philadelphia, PA, that will later house Sigma Sound Studios was built. In the late 1950s, Joe Tarsia, moonlighting from his day gig at Philco Electronics, catches the recording studio bug when he is asked to repair a tape recorder at the studio of Tony Mammarella, head of the Philadelphia-based record label Swan Records. Swan later becomes the first U.S. label to release a record by the Beatles, She Loves You. Meanwhile, around 1958, Reco Art Recording Studio is opened on the second floor of the 212 North 12th Street location. Reco Art's history goes back to the 1940s, and it was previously located at 1305 Market Street in Center City, Philadelphia. The studio's engineer, Emil Corson, is a master of mono recording, and Reco Art was where many early Philadelphia hit records by artists such as Bobby Rydell, Danny and the Juniors, the Dovells, and Chubby Checker were recorded. The Swan Records release of She Loves You by the Beatles was mastered there. Reco Art operates at the 12th Street location until the mid-1960s, at which point Emil Corson leaves the recording business. In 1962, Joe Tarsia takes a full-time engineering position at Philadelphia's Cameo Parkway Records. Cameo's 309 South Broad Street location will later become even more significant in Sigma Sound and Philadelphia music history. Cameo Parkway becomes known for hit records by such artists as Chubby Checker, the Orlons, and Bobby Rydell. Tarsia eventually becomes chief engineer of the Cameo Studios. In addition to recording most of Cameo's artists, the studio hosts recording sessions for outside clients as well. While working at Cameo Parkway in the mid-1960s, Tarsia first works with producers Kenny Gamble and Leon Huff, initially on some regional hits and later on national hits with the Soul Survivors, Expressway to Your Heart, and the Intruders, We'll Be United. Other notable hit records recorded by Tarsia at Cameo include the Delphonics' La La Means I Love You with Tom Bell producing. With the post-British invasion decline of Cameo Parkway, Joe Tarsia sees that the future of the Philadelphia music scene lies with producers such as Gamble, Huff, and Bell, as well as in having his own studio. In 1967, he signs a lease for the facilities of the former Reco Art recording studio on the second floor of 212 North 12th Street. Frankfurt Wayne Recording Labs, which also becomes a significant part of the Philadelphia recording scene, had already moved into the mastering studio part of the facility in the front section of the second floor. On August 5, 1968, Joe Tarsia opens his facility, now called Sigma Sound Studios, for its first sessions. While the control room and studio are largely unchanged from how things were during the Reco Art days, Sigma opens as an 8-track facility with a Scully multi-track recorder, an Electrodyne 16-input, 8-output console, Altec 604 monitor speakers, Ampex AG440 stereo and 300 series mono mixdown machines, and the all-important Ampex 351 2-track used as a tape delay feeding either Reco Art's acoustic echo chamber or Sigma's first EMT plate echo, which was acquired cheaply when its first owner couldn't figure out how to set it up properly. That tape delay feeding into the reverb becomes a major part of both Sigma's and Philadelphia's sound. I couldn't find any good photos of that original Electrodyne console, but it looked much like this one on the cover of an Electrodyne sales brochure. Sigma's console, however, was all black and did not have multicolored input modules as shown here. The Scully 284 series 1-inch 8-track machine was similar to this photo from a Scully brochure, but it was set up in a cabinet with a 1-inch tape transport, a half-inch tape transport, and a total of 12 channel electronics modules for operation as separate 8-track and 4-track recorders, but with the possibility of upgrading to 1-inch 12-track capability. Gamble, Huff, Bell, and other clients of Tarsia's from Cameo Parkway followed him over to his new facility. Early hits recorded at Sigma include records by Archie Bell and the Drells, Jerry Butler, Joe Simon, and Dusty Springfield. Here's an early session at Sigma. That's producer Kenny Gamble in the center. Here's another photo of that same session. Left to right, we have Gamble, Norman Harris, Bobby Eli, and Roland Chambers on guitars, and I believe that is Roland's brother Carl on drums. This is Dusty Springfield in the control room listening to a playback. Here's a later session from around 1970 with members of the Philly Rhythm section. Left to right, we have singer Barbara Mason, Norman Harris on guitar, that might be Carl Chambers on drums, then Bobby Eli on guitar playing through an Echoplex, and behind him Ron Baker on bass. Around March of 1970, Sigma goes 16-track with the addition of a Scully 288-16 recorder like the one in this photo from a Scully brochure. Once again, I don't have a photo of the actual machine Sigma owned. The original 8-output Electrodyne console continues to be used, and work begins on a customized 24-input, 16-output Electrodyne. In June of 1971, the new 16-track Electrodyne console is installed. The first session to use it is a live radio broadcast of Todd Rundgren for Philadelphia's WMMR-FM. Throughout that year and into 1972, Sigma hosts a number of such live broadcasts. The careers of Billy Joel and Bonnie Raitt are launched with the help of the exposure they received from their WMMR Sigma Sound radio concerts. The photo of the Electrodyne shown here was taken later in the 1970s after it had been upgraded with a 24-track monitor mix section. The original Altec 604E speakers and utility cabinets have been replaced with Audio-Technique's Big Red 604-based monitors with Mastering Lab crossovers. The small speakers in between them are a pair of KLHs, and yes, that Panasonic radio above the producer's table is another important element of the monitoring setup. You'll see a similar radio in just about all the other Sigma studios you'll see during this presentation. The control room was still relatively unchanged from how it was during its Reco Art days, other than some cosmetic changes and, of course, the equipment. Here are a couple of views of the studio, also from the late 70s. The studio was about 28 by 40 feet in size, with a ceiling height of approximately 12 feet. In this first photo, that glass window on the back wall in the center of the picture, behind the drum kit, is a small ISO booth. This photo shows more of the studio. Just like the control room, the studio was largely unchanged from what it was like during the Reco Art days, other than some changes to the color scheme and new lighting. This studio, Studio A, later renamed Studio 1, was the room where many of the biggest Sound of Philadelphia hits were recorded and mixed on that Electrodyne console, along with other notable projects such as David Bowie's Young Americans album. In 1972, producers Gamble and Huff, seen here in a later photo with singer Lou Rawls, signed a distribution deal for their Philadelphia International Records label with Columbia CBS Records and have their first huge hits with such artists as the O'Jays, Billy Paul, and Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes, featuring Teddy Pendergrass on lead vocals. Tom Bell produces big hits for the Stylistics for Avco Records and the Spinners on Atlantic. In 1972, Sigma acquires a full set of Dolby A noise reduction units, making it among the first independent studios in the U.S. to offer multi-track noise reduction. The Scully 16-track is replaced by an MCI JH16, and 3M M64 2-track and mono recorders replace the older Ampex mixdown machines. Sigma gets a lease on the first floor of its 12th Street location, and construction begins on a second studio on that floor. In this photo, taken in the mid-1970s, we see engineer J. Mark mixing on the Electrodyne console. Behind him is the MCI JH16, and yes, those are 24 Dolby A361 units, stacked up in the rack on the right. Early in 1973, Sigma Sound opened Studio B, later renamed Studio 2, on the first floor. While smaller than Studio A upstairs, it is equipped for quad monitoring and mixing via its 24-input MCI JH400 series console. The tape machines comprise an MCI 16-track and 3M M64 2-track mono and 4-track recorders. The ancillary equipment, Dolby A noise reduction, Altec 604 monitor speakers, etc., is similar to that in Studio A. In April 1973, I joined Sigma Sound as an assistant engineer. I was hired with the opening of Studio B. Here's a photo, taken in 1978, of Studio 2 set up for a horn overdub date, looking back towards the control room. The studio is approximately 24 by 27 feet with a 10-foot ceiling. The control room is approximately 16 by 16. Thanks to sessions from Gamble, Huff, Bell, and the many other labels and producers of the expanding Sound of Philadelphia scene, the two Sigma studios are booked 18 hours a day, 6 to 7 days a week. For a few years following the closing of Cameo Parkway Records, its headquarters and studios at 309 South Broad Street served as the Philadelphia location of New York City's Regent Sound Studios. Around 1973, following the closure of Regent in Philadelphia, Gamble, Huff & Bell Productions acquire 309, and plans are made for the opening of another Sigma Sound studio there. In March of 1974, Sigma opened Studio A South, later renamed Studio 4, at the 309 location. The studio is open to what was formerly the smaller of the two studios at Cameo Parkway and is Sigma's first 24-track studios. It featured a 3M M79 multi-track machine. The console is another MCI JH400 like the one in Studio B, and the rest of the equipment is similar to that in Studios A and B. The first 24-track project recorded there is Tom Bell producing the duo of Derek and Cindy for Thunder Records. Here's a view of the studio taken from a tall ladder looking down over the piano booth and keyboard area. That's the custom-made Tiffany-style lamp which served as the recording sign. This is the drum booth. As you can see, the studio is very 1970s with lots of shag carpet everywhere. While Studio A South is operated primarily for sessions by Gamble, Huff & Bell Productions, Sigma does book outside clients into that room as well, and sessions for Gamble, Huff & Bell were still booked into the 212th Street studios. Studio B, shown here, is converted to 24-track shortly after the 309 studio opens. Studio A doesn't get converted to full 24-track capability until 1975, when modifications are made to the Electrodyne console in order to add 24-track monitoring. Another major technical milestone occurs in 1974 when Sigma becomes one of the first recording studios anywhere to acquire automated mixing in the form of two Allison Research Memory's Little Helper, or MLH, VCA-based automation units, which could be connected to any of Sigma's MCI or Electrodyne consoles. The automation programmer at the bottom of the unit generated digital automation data that was recorded on one channel of the multitrack tape. That data could then be read back, and modifications to the mix could then be recorded on a second data track on the tape, and a final mix would be programmed by going back and forth between those two data tracks while making whatever changes were desired. The MLH recorded only fader moves along with channel mutes. All the usual automation controls for each channel, such as read, write, and update, along with group assignment, are on the MLH unit, as shown here in close-up. Faders for the 5 VCA groups were housed in a separate small box connected to the MLH unit. Here's producer Tom Moulton working on a mix in Studio 1 using one of those group boxes. Sigma Sound's two Memories Little Helper units were used well into the early 1980s. Here's Joe Tarsia mixing with one of them at the 309 South Broad Street studio. Note the group master box on the left side of the photo. The use of automated mixing at Sigma Sound was the subject of an article written by engineer J. Mark, which appeared in the December 1974 issue of Recording Engineer Producer magazine. The photo in the lower right of this page from the article shows Jay and Joe Tarsia along with one of the MLH units in Studio One. In 1976, Sigma Sound opened its first studio in New York City at 1697 Broadway on the 10th floor of the Ed Sullivan Theater building, which was previously the location of Broadway recording studios. The first room open, Studio 5, featured acoustic design by John Storick. The console was a 32-input custom JH440 console built by MCI, which was based on their MCI 400 series. The console's Sigma-specified special features, such as a more sophisticated EQ and changes to how the send groups worked, are eventually incorporated by MCI into its 500 and 600 series consoles. The most outstanding feature of the Sigma MCI console was the mix automation system, Ellison Research Memory Plus, which included self-nulling knobless faders. The user pushed a continuous loop plastic band up and down the fader track. A bar pattern printed on the moving band was read by an optical sensor in order to encode the fader's position, which was indicated by a column of LEDs that could be seen through the band. The tape recorders are initially all 3M M79s. This photo shows one of the Ampex ATR 102 two-tracks that were acquired later. Over the next several years, Sigma opened 2 additional studios at the 1697 Broadway location, both of which featured Sigma MCI custom consoles with Memory Plus automation similar to the one in Studio 5. The first of those rooms is Studio 7, a somewhat smaller studio than Studio 5, which proved to be very popular. Steely Dan did much of the recording for their album Gaucho in Studio 7. In 1980, Studio 8 was opened on the 8th floor of the Ed Sullivan Theater building. It was designed primarily as a mix room with a small overdub studio and featured a 48-input version of the custom MCI JH440 console. The main monitor speakers were Audio-Technique's Big Red 604s. The smaller speakers on the console's meter bridge were ROR E3s, which were similar to the Auratone sound cubes. The RORs sounded a little better and were finished in real wood. This is the small overdub studio, which measured about 17 by 17 feet. The 3 studios at Sigma New York City attract a diverse clientele, including such artists as Ashford and Simpson, shown here in Studio 5, Madonna, Steely Dan, the Talking Heads, and the Village People. The Sigma Sound New York story continues until Joe Tarsia decides in the late 1980s to get out of an ever more competitive New York City studio scene, and he sells Sigma Sound New York in 1988. The studio continues under new ownership, but eventually becomes a casualty of the David Letterman Show's need for more office space in the Ed Sullivan Theater building, which resulted in Sigma New York being closed. In 1977, Sigma Sound Philly goes 48-track with the acquisition of one of the first BTX synchronizers. Mixing 48-track was a bit improvisational at first. Here's the setup we initially used in Studio 2. Shown here are 2 3M M79 24-track machines with the BTX synchronizer in between them. You can see the corner of the MCI JH400 24-input console on the left and the MLH automation behind it with the keyboard controller for the BTX on top. And in the right foreground, we have a Biamp Labs auxiliary console for the second set of 24 tracks, the output of which was fed into the MCI. Here's engineer Dirk Devlin mixing using that setup. Starting in 1980 and continuing into 1981, Studio One and the entire second floor of the 212 North 12th location was closed down for a complete rebuild and renovation. The entire second floor was gutted and the studio was completely rebuilt from scratch. Here we are partway through the construction. And here's that same view once the new studio was completed. The new Studio One features acoustic consulting by George Augsburger, a 48-input customized Sphere Eclipse C automated console. Sphere was an offshoot of Electrodyne, twin 3M M79 24-track machines with a BTX synchronizer, Ampex ATR 102 mixdown recorders, and URI 813 monitor speakers. The studio itself features variable acoustics, piano and drum booths, recessed bays for instrument amplifiers, and a large glassed-in isolation room for recording strings during large live tracking dates. The acoustics of the new Studio One, nicknamed Starship One, are featured in an article in the November 1981 issue of DB, the Sound Engineering magazine. This is another fisheye lens view of the studio that I took, which ended up on the cover. Here's that magazine cover. And this is a page from the article that appeared in that issue. In 1983, Studio 2 in Philly underwent a complete rebuild and redesign. The major changes are to the control room, which featured an MCI JH636 automated console, an Otari MTR90 Mark III 24-track, Ampex ATR 102 2 tracks, URI 813 monitor speakers, and improved acoustics. Acoustic and cosmetic changes were also made to the studio itself. Around this time, Sigma's 3M M79 24-track recorders are replaced with the Otari MTR90s. The black and red color scheme of the Otari 24-track recorders was custom for Sigma Sound. In the early 80s, Sigma Philadelphia entered the media services recording market for radio commercials, voiceovers, and audio post-production for video. Studio 3, formerly a tape copy and edit room, is upgraded for voiceover recording. Eventually, two new studios, 9 and 10, were built for voiceover work next door at 214 North 12th Street when Sigma acquires that adjacent building, a former apartment house. The 212 and 214 buildings are joined together to provide additional office space as well as the space for the two new studios. This is Studio 9, which was designed for audio post-production for video. A Q-Lock synchronizer made it possible to lock the 24-track Otari MTR90 to video. The studio featured a small voiceover booth along with this large control room. An adjacent room housed a variety of machines for various video formats, including a Sony BVH2000C format 1-inch VTR for laybacks and a 4-track 35 and 16mm mag film recorder. This is Studio 10, another small voiceover studio. The console is a sound workshop. Later, the Ampex AG440C 4-track recorder is replaced with an Otari MX5050 half-inch 8-track recorder with dBx noise reduction. In the early 1980s, the studio at 309 South Broad is closed down due to a decline in demand for studio time there. Sessions for Gamble, Huff, and Bell continued to be booked at the 212 North 12th Street location. Eventually, Gamble and Huff re-equipped the studio and operated on their own for a number of years. In 2010, a tragic fire destroyed much of the third floor where the studio was located. The 309 building was eventually sold and torn down in order to make room for yet another high-rise hotel. In 1987, Sigma Sound Philly acquired two Mitsubishi X850 32-track digital recorders and an X86 digital 2-track. Here's a Mitsubishi ad that ran in Pro Sound News, which includes a photo I took in Studio One, which Joe Tarsia appeared in order to publicize the acquisition. At the same time, Studio 2 was upgraded with an automated 60-input Mitsubishi Superstar console to go along with the update to digital 32-track. The MCI JH636 console that was formerly in Studio 2 was moved to Studio 9. The X850 is out of sight in front of the console. In case you're interested, the speakers on top of the console's meter bridge are Tannoy SRM12Bs. Also around this time, a 52-input Neve 8078 console was installed in Studio One, replacing the Sphere Eclipse C. Here's that console being lifted by crane up the front of the 212 building so it can be brought through the client lounge into the back of the control room. The Neve was originally built for the mix room at Utopia Studios in London. Prior to its installation, Sigma spent a couple of years upgrading the Neve to be suitable for use as a tracking as well as a mixing console. A completely new 32-channel monitor section was built. The original NeCam mix automation was replaced with a George Massenburg Labs moving fader automation system. In the early 1990s, Sigma Philadelphia acquires its first Pro Tools systems. At first, they are only used in the voiceover studios for radio spot production, but eventually they see more and more use for music recording activities such as editing and digital assembly. In the early 2000s, the Neve 8078 console in Studio One is replaced by an SSL 9000 series. Here's Joe Tarsia posing in front of the new console. In 2003, Joe Tarsia retires from the studio business and sells Sigma Sound Philadelphia. The studio will go through two different owners before finally being closed, with the entire 210, 212, 214 North 12th Street complex sold in 2015 to a developer intending to convert it to condominiums. Currently, the building lies empty, as all the interiors have been demolished. This, for instance, is all that now remains of Studio One and the entire second floor. With the sale of Sigma Sound came the issue of what would happen to the decades' worth of unclaimed and often forgotten master tapes that were stored by the studio either on premises or in two rented storage vaults a few blocks away. The nearly 7,000 analog and digital multi-track and mix tapes included recordings dating back to the earliest days of the studio, as well as more recent ones. That collection of tapes was donated by Joe Tarsia to Drexel University, and they now comprise the tape archive of the Sigma Sound collection at Drexel's Westphal College of Media Arts and Design. The collection also acquired some of Sigma's equipment and other materials. Overseeing the collection is Toby Shea, a professor in Drexel's music industry program. The purpose of the collection is not only to store and preserve the tapes, but to facilitate the use of those materials for research and as instructional materials for Drexel students. And occasionally a record label will contact Drexel to obtain copies of one of their long-forgotten masters for re-release. A full array of tape machines, both analog and digital, along with other necessary equipment, is available for transferring the tapes in the archive to digital format for long-term storage. Here's Joe Tarsia checking out those facilities. In January of 2015, production started on a documentary film about the Sigma Sound story. Shooting has been done at a number of locations in and around Philadelphia, including the now empty 212 North 12th Street building, Elm Street Studios in Conshohocken, PA, and the studios at Drexel University. The film will feature many of the producers, artists, and musicians from Sigma Sound's long history and, of course, members of the Sigma Sound staff. This photo shows Leon Huff of Gamble & Huff being interviewed at his home by musician, writer, and film producer Alan Slutsky. Work continues on the film, and no date has been set for the documentary's release. In October 2015, after years of lobbying by Joe Tarsia, the Pennsylvania Historical Commission erects a commemorative marker across from Sigma's 212 North 12th Street, Philadelphia location. The unveiling of the marker was a major media event, including a gala luncheon attended by Sigma staff members along with the studio's clients and musicians. Here's Joe Tarsi and his wife Cecilia posing in front of the marker after its unveiling. And here's what the marker says. As mentioned earlier, the Sigma Sound 212 North 12th Street building was sold to developers in 2015. Their plan is to convert it into condominiums, but currently the building sits empty. In early 2020, Max Uchester, the owner of a local record store called Brewerytown Beats and an enthusiastic fan of Philadelphia music, called a meeting in Center City, Philadelphia to discuss the possibility of preserving the Sigma Sound building. 212 North 12th is the last Philly music landmark of its kind that hasn't been torn down. The aim of this Save Sigma Sound effort is to have the building declared an official Philadelphia historic site in order that a museum, dedicated not just to Sigma but to Philadelphia music history in general, could be housed there. A number of former Sigma staff members attended, along with other members of the Philadelphia music and recording community. While some of the events intended as a follow-up to the meeting had to be canceled due to the COVID-19 pandemic, naming the Sigma building as a Philadelphia historic site was discussed in a meeting of the city's Committee on Historic Designation held in August of 2020. The owners of the building, however, want to contest that designation, so no decision has yet been made on the building's status. This brings us up to date on recent Sigma Sound-related events and concludes the virtual tour and history. What I'm going to do next is to give you a behind-the-scenes look at life in the studio, featuring the staff and some of the many producers, artists, and musicians that called Sigma home. It's by no means a complete look at everyone and everything, but it should impart something of the flavor of the place and time and the people who worked there. Let's start with a look at the studio staff. We're going to start in the main lobby of the 12th Street building. This is Joe Tarsi's wife Cecilia behind the switchboard at the main reception desk. Here's Sigma Sound founder and owner Joe Tarsi at the Sphere Console in Studio One. With him is Joni Sledge, part of the group Sister Sledge. Here's Joe editing in the tape copy room, and during a session at the 309 South Broad Street studio with assistant engineer Bruce Bluestein. This photo dates from about 1969 or 70 and shows engineer Carl Perullo in Control Room 1 with producer Tom Sellers. Now we've jumped ahead about 10 years to 1980. Once again, here's Carl in Studio 1. While the equipment has changed, the room is pretty much the same as it was in the previous picture. That's Grover Washington Jr. cueing a punch-in for engineer Pete Humphreys in the renovated Studio One. That's the Sphere Console they're sitting behind. Here's Pete checking out the drum kit in Studio 2 before a session. That's engineer Dirk Devlin at the MCI 400 console in Studio 2, and assistant engineer Bruce Bluestein along with Dirk in the 309 studio with one of the Memory's Little Helper automation units between them. That's Wayne Mulfong, head of Sigma's tech department with engineer Ken Present in Studio 2. Engineer Jim Doherty at the MCI JH440 console in Studio 7 in New York City. Engineer Joe Bees in Studio 3, one of the voiceover rooms. This is engineer Jim Gallagher mixing with producer Tom Bell in Studio 2 in 1980. Note the automation group master box between them. This is another rare shot of me behind the console, this time in 1988. Yes, that is an Ampex ATR 124 24-track recorder right behind my head to the right of the 3M M79. Sigma had the machine on loan for evaluation. Unfortunately, we did not buy it. What's surprising to me is how calm I look in this photo, because what's on the other side of the glass is this enormous orchestral date, possibly the largest one I ever recorded. The conductor in the middle of all that is Michael Bacon, brother of actor Kevin Bacon and one half of their Bacon Brothers musical group. Michael was also a film composer, and the session was for the soundtrack of a Jacques Cousteau documentary. The engineering staff was backed up by Sigma's assistant engineers and tape copyists. Here's Jeff Stewart in the original Studio 1 tidying up after a session. Here's Daryl Rogers writing up a mix of mine in the original Control Room 1. The mix automation we had at that time only recorded fader moves, which meant that all the other settings for a mix, EQ, reverb, and effects, patching, and auxiliary gear, had to be written up by hand on special pre-printed sheets made for that purpose. What Daryl was writing up was what I now like to refer to as my plugin collection, circa 1978. Nowadays, of course, we have software plugins and racks of analog gear, but what you see here is typical of what we had to work with back in the 70s. Here we have assistant engineer Vince Warsavage setting up in Studio 2. This is Carla Bandini writing up a mix in Studio 5 in New York City. Dave Humphreys making video copies in the machine room. While not actually part of Sigma Sound, Frankfurt Wayne Recording Labs was a very important part of the Philly sound, as they mastered most of the records recorded at Sigma. For many years, Frankfurt Wayne was located on the second floor of the 212 building along with Studio 1. Here's engineer Nimitar Sarakananda in one of the two cutting rooms. The lathes are Scully's with Westrix cutter heads, and yes, that actually is a recorder for 8-track cartridges in the upper right corner of this photo. Every studio needs a good technical support staff to keep things running smoothly. Here's Bob Titus during the installation of the Sphere console in Studio 1. Here we have Gene Kane and Jack Dyke in the repair shop in the basement. Some console maintenance in Studio 8 in New York City. Here's Mike Spitz, who many of you may know from the business he later founded, ATR Service Company. Not surprisingly, he's shown here aligning a tape machine. Let's now take a look at some recording sessions and a few of the artists, producers, and session musicians that came to Sigma Sound. We're looking over the shoulder of engineer Jim Gallagher during a horn overdub session in Studio 2 back in 1979. Here we have the trombones and trumpets, and the French horn set up in the back of the studio. This is the vocal group, the first choice in the original Studio 1. They had a hit with the song Armed and Extremely Dangerous in 1972. This photo is from 1978. That's Edgar Winter with bassist Jimmy Williams from a tracking date in Studio 1 in 1978. With drummer Keith Benson and Edgar listening to a playback in the control room. This is a string overdub session in the original Studio 1. That's Don Ronaldo, who is the contractor for most Philly Sound string and horn dates. Note the small speaker on a stand just behind his head to the left. That's what was used to play the backing track to the players when overdubbing. The idea was to keep the volume of those cue speakers as low as possible to minimize bleed of the track into the string microphones. We usually double track the strings, and that allowed us to make use of a little trick of ours to eliminate as much of that cue speaker bleed as possible. We would invert the polarity of all the microphones of one of the sets of strings, and when the two passes were combined, the speaker bleed would cancel out almost entirely. This is a string overdub session from a few years later in the renovated Studio One. By then we had convinced the string players to wear single-sided headphones, and we didn't need to use those small cue speakers anymore. This is Dexter Wansell in Studio 4 over at 309 South Broad with his Oberheim and Mini Moog. Dexter was a songwriter, producer, arranger, and artist for Gamble & Huff's Philadelphia International Records. Guitar player Herb Smith was also present on that same session for some overdubs. You can see that there was shag carpet just about everywhere, as was the fashion during the 1970s, and the studio was very dead acoustically except for a small live area at its front which had oak walls and a slate floor. This is a photo that spans 2 generations. Clockwise from the top we have Joe Tarsia, lead singer Eddie Levert of the O'Jays, Joe's son, engineer Michael Tarsia, and Eddie's son, singer Gerald Levert. I'm going to conclude this photographic tour of Sigma Sound Studios with a partial listing of the many clients that the studio played host to over the years. I just wanted to say a few things to the students here from the SRT program, just about how things have changed, not just about the music and recording industry, but with the whole situation and jobs and training jobs for that industry. Sorry. Because almost 50 years ago, I was in pretty much the same position you're in now. You know, I was a student and I wanted to work in a recording studio. But back then, there were just very few resources, you know, for anyone who wanted to like work in the industry and to find out about things, learn the technology and all that. There weren't that many books or magazines that dealt directly with what went on in studios, and the books you could find, they were really technical and they really didn't say a whole lot about what went on during like real recording sessions, you know. And at that time I managed to, like, little bits and pieces from magazines, books, what have you, to you know, get a vague, hazy idea what went on in a recording studio, but that was enough to make me decide that I wanted to work in one. And back then, you typically became an audio engineer by getting some sort of entry-level job in a studio. It could be something as menial as like cleaning up or running errands. And then if you were lucky, you might progress to, you know, actually working in the studio as an assistant engineer, you know, with an experienced engineer and helping out on those sessions. You know, you'd set up microphones, run the tape machines, keep the paperwork for the session straight, and so on. And after, you know, a few years of that, you know, if you showed that you like had actually like assimilated enough about what you needed to know in order to be an engineer, you might get to engineer on your own. Hang on 1 second. Back then, there was only one school for audio recording, which was a place called the Institute of Audio Research in New York City. And they created some like really basic courses just to fill for the need for people trained in the new technology that was coming into studios at the time. We're talking about the late 60s, early 70s, which was like 16-track recording and the more complicated audio consoles that came with that. And so I found out that IAR had a course called Studio Technology and Practice, which turned out to be like a 60 course hour, just very basic orientation to what went on in the recording studio. I signed up for that. I commuted twice a week for a few months to take the course. And from that, though, I was able to land a job at Sigma Sound as an assistant engineer. I was the first person they ever hired who had some sort of prior formalized training. The course was a lot of theory. I mean, we studied console signal flow with diagrams. We really had no equipment there except for one old Ampex mono tape machine that we had that so we could learn how to align a tape recorder. And we didn't see the inside of a studio until towards the end of the course, and that was just like a quick 1 hour tour of a couple of New York City studios, although one of them was Electric Lady Studios, and that was like still set up the way it was when Jimi Hendrix was still alive. So that was a really cool thing to see. So again, I got the job with Sigma and as an assistant and, worked on sessions. Typically, I was like working like 50, 60 hours a week in the studio. And author Malcolm Gladwell has written it takes about 10,000 hours, he thinks, to become an expert at something. And, with those kinds of hours in a couple of years, I, ran up that 10,000 hours pretty fast. But now the situation is really different for somebody wanting to get into audio. You have programs like the one here at Monco, and you get hands-on experience with some really cool gear that you see behind me. And that there are other resources, though, that weren't available back then that I really would encourage everyone to take advantage of. There's lots of books and magazines on audio recording, ranging from how-to books, and biographies and memoirs of well-known engineers and record producers, making of stories of hit albums, and the like. I have to admit, though, I'm a little skeptical about books on mixing because I still think you really have to see and hear it being done, in order to really learn what goes on there. But you really should just check out all those books. There's documentaries, instructional videos, all of which I said were not available back when I started out. And another thing I would just encourage everyone to do is to listen to a lot of different recordings of different kinds of music and on, different playback systems, headphones, speakers. And the whole idea there is to, develop an ear for the critical listening of music and recording quality and music production as well. And sometimes they call this ear training, but it's not really your ears that are training. You're training your brain to, either consciously or subconsciously, evaluate what your ears send the brain. And that way, again, you become a critical listener. And, okay. The last thing I just wanted to mention is just the whole job scenario, which is just really different now from what it was back when I started out. Back then, typically people wanted to work in a recording studio for records, and eventually work up to a staff, engineer position there, like I did at Sigma. The 70s were probably like the golden age of the classic analog multi-track recording studio, but that didn't last, and the kinds of jobs that were available then are not that common now. So there's lots of other areas of audio, though, that you should think about. Audio for film and video, live sound, archiving and restoration, radio and TV broadcasting, streaming, and all that. And you might have to work as a freelance rather than a staff position, with an established company. So you have to be a little bit of an entrepreneur to do that as well. And again, just really want to encourage everyone, though, to take advantage of all the resources that are available now about audio recording, because you can learn a lot from that, and a lot of it is just some of these documentaries are fun to watch and all that. But that's basically what I wanted to say to the students, which is, the situation is much different now from what it was then. You have a lot of advantages that, people, getting into audio didn't have when I started. And, it's great. I mean, the fact that we're here in this facility, talking about this just really shows how that whole scene has changed.
Thank you, Arthur. I am going to see if there's any other questions. I don't see any questions. Now's the time we can take some questions.
We are taking questions.
Is there any questions? Check. Is there any questions? Go ahead, Hallie. You know what? You should just write it in. Just put it in the chat, and then I'll read it out loud. Meanwhile, I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today. It's been a great pleasure and honor to have Arthur here today to help talk about the story of Sigma. I'm very happy to see a lot of the Sigma people on this Zoom. And again, special thanks to Joe Tarsia, who was on the Zoom today. We obviously owe all this to you, and we appreciate that for sure and want that recognized. Let's see if there's any questions. Was Sigma named because Sigma is the symbol for summing, or?
Joe Tarsia tells this question about how the name for Sigma came about, and yes, that's part of it. The story starts when he's at a Greek restaurant, and I think there was Greek letters on the placemat. And he, having been an electronics engineer, of course, he saw, this symbol, the E-like symbol for Sigma, and thought that would be a good name for the studio. Originally, he was going to call it, and legally for years, the studio was called Quaker Sound Studios, if you can believe that, and which was, not exactly a sexy name. So, but he liked the whole idea of Sigma summation, mixing and all that, and it became Sigma Sound.
So, yes to both. Any other questions? Okay. All right. Well, we're gonna close this up then. And again, I'd like to appreciate everyone for being here. And
Yes, thank you. And everybody in the Zoom audience, thank you for tuning in.
Yes, it's awesome. We have very many people. It was great. And this will be available online once we edit everything together at mc3.edu/masterclass. And you'll see all of our other 15 or so masterclasses that we have done previous to this. So once again, thank you, Arthur, everybody. Yes, all right. Thank you very much, everybody, and we're signing out. Thank you all.